We're live. Good evening. My name is Arna Landrum, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a campaign director at Daily Kos and a founder of Daily Kos's Liberation League, which is the team in our activism department that uplifts the leadership, builds the capacity in, and centers frontline communities. And by frontline communities, we mean Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, LGBTQ plus communities, disability justice advocates, folks fighting for workers' rights, and liberations from all kinds of systemic oppression. Last summer, I live in a little town you may have heard of called Minneapolis, Minnesota. And last year, my town found ourselves in the center of national news when Floyd was murdered at the hands of Derek Chauvin. People everywhere demanded justice for George and all who have been murdered, unjustly targeted, and harmed by police. Communities also cried out for the abolition of police. So here we are. It's a year later, and George Floyd Square, which is the autonomous police free zone built by community members, is being demolished by the city, who has deemed justice served. Derek Chauvin has been convicted, but is that one conviction of one cop really justice? What can we learn from George Floyd Square and countless other efforts in the world to care deeply for each other, to secure public safety, and hold those who violate the community accountable? Luckily, I know someone who's not only written extensively about community accountability and transformative justice, but who's been working with and inside communities who are building alternatives to the police and other state interventions. I'm so grateful to introduce the Daily Coast community to Ejeris Dixon. Ejeris Dixon, pronouns they and she, is an organizer and political strategist with 20 years of experience working in racial justice, LGBTQ, anti-violence, and anti-violence and economic justice movements. They are the executive director of Vision Change Win Consulting, which you can find at www.visionchangewin.com, where they partner with organizations to build their capacity and deepen the impact of their organizing strategies. From 2010 to 2013, Ejeris served as the deputy director in charge of the community organizing department at the New York City Anti-Violence Project, where they directed national, statewide, and local organizing and advocacy initiatives on hate violence, domestic violence, police violence, and sexual violence. From 2005 to 2010, Ejeris worked as the founding program coordinator of the Safe Outside the System Collective at the Audre Lorde Project, where they worked on creating transformative justice strategies to address hate and police violence. They are a co-editor of Beyond Survival, Stories and Strategies of the Transformative Justice Movement, with Leah Lakshmi Piepsra Samrahasana. Their essay, their essay, Building Community Safety, Practical Steps Toward Liberatory Transformation, is featured in the anthology, Who Do You Serve? Who Do You Protect? Police Violence and Resistance in the United States. Thank you for joining us, Ejeris, and please correct my pronunciation of Leah's name.
No worries. Arna, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Daily Coast community. Yeah, thanks for everyone for being here. So my name's Ejeris Dixon. I do use they and she pronouns. I am coming to you from Brooklyn, New York on occupied Lenape land. And I did edit a book I'm really proud of, Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories of the Transformative Justice Movement, with my co-editor, Leah Lakshmi Piepsra Samrasinghe. I know that people have a lot of places to be in these times, so I don't take your time for granted. And I also recognize that we're still navigating a collective trauma, that you all have done your own surviving, your own learning, your own reading, and have probably made it through difficult circumstances yourself. I hope to share a bit of what I know from community safety, transformative justice, abolition. I also see myself as a person in practice and invite you to join me as a person in practice, meaning there are things I know, there are things I'm learning, there are things I'm growing, and I like to grow with people. So that's just to let you know how I roll. And yeah, I'll go from there. So transformative justice means a lot to me. And I intend to talk less as a like 101 on transformative justice, but just like, let's talk about the ways that communities have been keeping themselves safe for, for long periods of time and how we can continue to do that. So transformative justice resonated with me. I had a history in movement work, in community organizing around economic justice issues, and racial justice issues. And I ended up getting a job at the Audre Lorde Project with a dream project of working within queer and trans communities of color to address violence without relying on police or prisons. But it resonated with me also because I have been living community-based and strategies for addressing violence for huge parts of my life. So that is a slide of mini me, and I still make that face. And I grew up witnessing violence as a young person. I grew up in a family where there was violence within my home. I grew up with a family that was navigating mental health crisis, violence, and police harassment. And we never wanted to have the harm doers and the people who've caused me harm. I've never wanted them arrested. I've just wanted violence to stop. And I knew pretty clearly at a young age that violence ending and arrest were two different things, because I had witnessed police harassment, I had witnessed police brutality, and I had been taught by family members to be careful and wary of the police. And there were ways that within my family and my life, we needed supports that we didn't have access to. We needed supports that understood the needs of Black families and Black communities, and that also believed in transformation and had alternative systems to what we were given. And so I believe in TJ because the systems that we were handed, whether it was like 911 or policing, didn't serve me and have already failed me. And I learned that at the age of the picture that you see there, which I think I was 4 or 5. I also, I believe that most people in their lifespan will both experience harm and cause harm in some way, shape, or form, and will not locate myself outside of that too. I too have caused harm, like many. I have been held accountable by people. I've been called out. I think that sometimes we learn patterns and we need our communities to call on us and to move us through. And whether it was, no matter what side of violence or harm I've been on, I do think that transformation rarely happens within a prison, and transformation rarely happens, does not happen from police. The last piece of transforming harm that I think was important is that I kind of came up as a young person in queer and trans communities of color, in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian activist communities. And there's also a lot of discrimination that queer and trans people face within the service industry. And so there are very few, there's a growing number of domestic violence shelters that will house trans people. There are ways that anti-violence movements haven't always had the resources or support or strategies for people who didn't want to call the police. So I also grew up in communities where we were intervening in each other's relationships. We were safety planning for our friends who had experienced sexual violence. We were housing each other on our couches when people had experienced violence. We knew that the systems that were set up were designed to target us more so than support. I'm also letting y'all know that I'm not going to be able to track the chat. I do see that people are chatting. I will be able to track it when we get to a Q&A. So I will be happily looking at what you're naming at that point. So things that people probably know or have already heard, that our political system is not neutral. That many systems of policing have roots, whether in the United States, have roots in slave patrols in the South, in union busting or forcing labor in the North, and that our political system was designed to protect the lives and property of white, cisgender, upper class citizens, and often men. So while we are given information that our political system is neutral, our systems actually are not. And in some ways, I'm one of those people who have actually, I've done police reform. I've even done police training. These are the things that help me understand why I am an abolitionist, because I saw the futility of so many different efforts firsthand. And I also recognize that within the culture of policing, and also within the dominant culture of the United States, some people are seen as harm doers, and some people are seen as more innocent than others. And so while we are virtually together, I would like people to just take a second to just close your eyes. And if you can close your eyes and imagine a bad person, a harmful person, and to explore the race of that person, to explore the gender of that person. Is that person upper class, working class, poor? The tone of voice of that person. And to sit with it, and to sit with this harm doer in your mind. Folks can open their eyes. I'm not going to ask you to share what that person looked like, but I have done this exercise before, and overwhelmingly people are picturing Black folks. Folks are picturing lower income folks. A lot of people, not all, are picturing more masculine folks. There is a pre-scripted sense of who the harm doers are, both in culture, and that impacts how communities are policed. It impacts how and who has access to safety, and what kind of safety. So all that to say, one thing that's really important to me is because systems of policing were designed to protect certain people, there are many of us who for generations have had to create our own systems of safety. And one of the things that I think is really important to name is that while some people may be learning about abolition and community safety projects, many marginalized and oppressed people in their own families or histories, or when you speak to elders, or even in your own life, many people have already addressed harm, abuse, or violence outside of prisons and policing, out of necessity. And so I often think that we're not necessarily doing something that is new. Sometimes we're doing work that people find uncomfortable. Sometimes there is an internalized way that all of us who've already protected ourselves don't value those stories as their own form of strategy. And if the concept of abolition or community safety or transformative justice feels difficult for some folks, it's because the systems of policing were set up to protect you. And that can impact our own viewpoints on this work. Um, I also believe that the histories of community safety strategies and transformative justice are rooted in a history that the state hasn't wanted documented. Like if we had like long histories of all the ways communities have kept ourselves safe, we would be directly challenging the efficacy or the kind of promoted notion of the efficacy of policing and prisons. Um, and so one of the things when I was in a community organization, we used to do a lot of story sharing of ways we had already kept ourselves safe. And we would interview elders, we would talk to the elders and their family. And some of that actually is the basis of my passion for this work and what I've already learned. So I guess if there's one thing I want you to take away from what I'm naming, it's that Black, Indigenous people of color, disabled folks, sex workers, queer and trans people, low-income people, we have been creating safety for ourselves for generations. And so some examples of this. For people who have heard of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and their activities in Freedom Summer, which was a lot of organizing of mostly low-income Black folks in Mississippi, and trying to both push back against the white supremacist violence and the inability for people to register to vote. There were safety patrols that protected SNCC workers because of the violence that they were facing. These safety patrols were from the community and were trained up within community. And they were a necessity for that form of organizing work. We could also be talking about my mom told me stories. My mom grew up in the 50s and 60s in New Orleans. And she would tell me stories of a household on her street where there was repeated intimate partner violence, or people also call it domestic violence. And within this, they had an informal group of, I think it was some religious leaders and teachers and people with status, people who were seen as important, who would intervene, who would go and knock on the door and say what's going on, who would talk to the harm doer, who would say, we don't want this in on our street. And what do we need to do for this to change? We could also talk about the Freedom House ambulance service in Pittsburgh, which I'm really excited about. There have been more and more of these alternative to 911 projects popping up, but in 1968, the Black community in Pittsburgh was getting really poor emergency medical service response. And a group of Black folks, mostly unemployed folks, and some doctors trained people in kind of in basic first aid and care techniques, and created their own ambulance system. This system, in fact, pioneered some new strategies in pre-hospital emergency care and helped inspire other systems in other cities. Or we can talk about an organization I really love, Communities United Against Violence, which was founded in 1979 in San Francisco. It was an organization of LGBTQ people, but I think mostly gay men, founded in the wake of the assassinations of Harvey Milk and George Moscone, and also a series of attacks and raids of LGBTQ communities in San Francisco. And they had a whistle campaign where people would carry whistles, and if somebody needed support, if somebody needed help, people would use their whistles to signal help, and other people would come to their aid. So now these are all smaller, well, they're not all small, but these are all various examples. It's a smattering of examples from different points in history that still have continuity today. And it's my experience that if you look at many histories of resistance movements as we are building new worlds or challenging capitalism or challenging racism or sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, if we're looking at racial justice or anti-war, anti-colonial movements, in order to ensure that our folks can be involved, ensure that the most oppressed communities can be engaged, we'll also see a history of mutual aid efforts, of addressing harm and violence within movement groups, of people feeding each other, of people housing each other, because either folks could not get support, also immigrant justice movements, because folks could not get support from the state because people were fearful of violence, because people had experienced violence. And so our communities taking care of each other, or oppressed and marginalized communities taking care of each other, has a really long history and legacy that is kind of essential to connect with so many forms of political work that we are doing now. So I really think that the grassroots histories of community safety and movement building work have a lot to teach us today. And I really believe in centering the voices of the most oppressed people and of survivors of violence in the conversation of how do we build safety for all, as opposed to the fears or critiques of those who are most privileged. Because when we center the critiques, not that I don't mind critique, I am a person who actually loves a good, loves to get into critical conversation with a strong root. But we're also, when we center the critiques, we're choosing whose perspectives to center. One thing that I know is that I have a really long history in anti-violence work. I started, I've done, I think as Irna said, sexual violence work, homophobic and transphobic violence work, intimate partner violence work, police violence work, and I did regular incident support for about a decade. I've worked on over 50 murders and hundreds of incidents. And what I saw from my own experience, and it's also well documented that people with the highest rates of repression and marginalization also experience the highest rates of violence, but both the highest rates of interpersonal violence and also police and state violence. And that's why I believe that abolition really allows us to center the safety of the most marginalized people, of the people who need the most support around violence, of the people who are experiencing the highest frequencies of violence, and the people who've been systemically ignored and attacked. And I love this quote from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. Abolition means not just the closing of prisons, I would say, and ending policing, but the presence instead of vital systems of support that many communities lack. And a dear genius friend and comrade, Miriam Kaba, also says it's not just about abolishing prisons, but it's about making this supposed need obsolete. So I think I see abolition as a critical safety strategy, and a safety strategy that includes people like me and families like mine and the communities that I grew up with. All that to say, I do really understand fear or critiques that people may raise. I I love a skeptic. My skepticisms often come from questions of, are you considering me and will I be safe? And so people often name concerns around what happens with sexual violence or on rapists. And the hard truth for all of us who do sexual violence work know is that very little sexual violence is already reported. I would almost say almost everyone here probably knows someone who's experienced sexual violence and not reported it. There is an article called What About the Rapists and Murderers by Angel Parker that's on the Transform Harm website. And within this, Angel names that only 6% of reported rapes result in jail time. There's also this piece around what about murder? And I think it's important to name that I don't think prisons or policing are solving murder, reducing murder, or ending murder, right? It's a place to house a problem and assume that that is an answer. And so within Beyond Survival, there's an article by Audrey Huntley, and you should check out her whole body of work. And she's an Indigenous feminist artist and activist who, through her organization, No More Silence, launched a community-based murder investigation where they tracked different murders that were happening within her community, where people were actually able to get more information about what happened, where she was able to offer support to surviving families, and in some ways, closure, more closure than the state was offering them. And I also think that there is what the criminal legal system does is it actually often erases the need to truly understand why people cause harm and violence. There is a much deeper need to understand what transforms sexual violence, what transforms repetitive harm and repetitive violence, and to get sharper. One of the things I really noticed when I shifted into anti-violence work was that how much the notion of the good people and the bad people and putting the bad people away really erased our ability to say, here are the 4 things that end violence. So when we talk about transformative justice, we often mean strategies that prevent, intervene, respond, and support people to heal from violence, taking into account the conditions that people are impacted by, and through strengthening relationships and communities. And this is pulled from a definition written by Mia Mingus, also on the Transform Harm website. And some ways that can look. There are more and more groups that are creating alternatives to 911. There's an organization called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon. There are many people who are working on separate mental health interventions and supports. There are projects through Critical Resistance called Oakland Power Projects, where people are building and training people in the skills to address a whole host of medical needs outside of 911, and also building emergency responses that are separate from police and prisons. My organization does a lot of training on how you can intervene in violence when you see it, and how groups and organizations, or really any group you're a part of, can create safety teams to intervene and address violence and harm without relying on police. There's a toolkit called the Creative Interventions Toolkit, and Fumbling Towards Repair, which are both toolkits and handbooks where people actually detail how to start and move through an accountability process. Let's say there is violence that has happened in your family, and the person who has caused harm is willing to be held accountable. There are whole trainings and handbooks and guides. They're very long, and I'm not going to detail them here because you all can do your own deepening there. Sometimes there's a lot that can just be done around learning safety planning. How will you respond when someone in your life mentions that they've experienced violence and they want your help, whether that be a family member or a dear friend? That first happened to me at 12 when one of my friends disclosed that she was experiencing violence from a family member. And I wish I had been in more contexts where I could learn where I learned earlier on how to receive with care. What I knew to do then was that she was going to tell a teacher, and I knew to spend time with her. There's also a deep need for us to understand more about what consent is, because there's a lot of culture that trains us in the opposite, that trains us in coercion. And the last is there are several organizations, and I've been a part of them, that have been creating harm-free zones or areas where people are building skills in violence intervention and a whole host of and safety teams, and finding ways that they are going, their neighborhood, a series of blocks, their street, will intervene in violence without relying on prisons or police. And so people at this point, there's a lot, the ways that what can you do? I have a list of resources, and I think you can learn more about this work, because there is no way we can build the systems that we need for safety for all of us without more involvement. And what the criminal legal system tells us is that it's only certain people's quote unquote job to intervene in violence and harm, but we also know that most people disclose experiences of violence to people they know first. So there's almost a responsibility of being just a good human in community, of learning more on how we support survivors and move through harm and intervene in violence. Many of the groups that I've named can be joined, and there's both the Transform Harm website that names how people can get involved. I love the organization Critical Resistance, that has been leading abolitionist movements for, I think, over 20 years, and they have open memberships. There's also a website called 1 Million Experiments that details a whole host of ways that people are practicing community safety, from Interrupting Criminalization, which is an incredible group that is doing a lot of work around documenting and creating strategies for us to intervene in violence and harm. You can amplify the work as you see it on social media of any of these groups. You can raise funding. There's a lot, most of these groups have limited resources and are hesitant to take money from, often don't take government funds, and sometimes don't take foundation funds either, mostly because people want to make sure that their line of accountability is to the community. And there's another piece, there's this way that many of us want to be experts in a thing that, I don't know, I don't see us as experts. I see many of us as well practiced. And if I didn't take risks and learned through doing, I don't know if I'd know what I knew. I don't know if I would have learned what I know now. With that said, I guess I just want to name that, as in history, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, marginalized communities, queer and trans communities, low-income communities, we will continue to build community safety. And I invite you all to join us. I invite you to expand the ways that you participate in justice movements, to think about ways that you can deepen your skill sets, to see yourself as a part of movements and of collective care networks, and to help us all expand the systems that we need. So here are some of the resources that I named that I think I can connect with Erna to get them sent out to you all. It's a mix of some that cost money, but many that don't. And all I want to say is thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for your interest in this work. And yeah, and I'm down to keep chatting.
Excuse me, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. Thank you, Ejeris, for all of this information. And I said so in the chat, but I really, in particular, appreciate how you contextualize this work in history so that folks know that this isn't, right, like a flash in the pan. It's not a fad. It's not something that people haven't already been giving not only deep consideration to, but actually doing in real life, right? So we did say that we would have a Q&A after your presentation. One of the questions already that we had gotten was, can you type the websites in the chat? There was just the slide with some of the websites and information. And yes, I will follow up with an email for everyone who was able to make it and who registered to make sure that you get all of those resources. And so now we open the floor to our community to pose any questions, curiosities, or just like burning thoughts that you have right now. And while we wait, I see all of the appreciations in the chat. I hope you do get a chance to look at some of those. I see another question, Ejeris, about whether the PowerPoint will be available to folks.
I think I can, let me check it. Sometimes I like to create a resource page as opposed to the PowerPoint, because sometimes the resources are richer that way. Sure. But yes, we will get you what I can answer is yes, we will get you the information. Ooh, what can churches do to help? Sorry, can I just jump into that? Because I think that is, so there are so many things. Churches can do when and how it feels appropriate, depending on the level of social justice work that your church is doing. When churches can be sources of mobilization for either when marches, when violence has happened in the community, for defund and abolitionist movements. Churches can also create education on what violence is and how and what consent is. There's a way that we need to teach people how to treat each other well in the places where they trust each other. And so recognizing that often religious communities are trusted containers. And we also have to name that there are religious communities where there are histories, like, I'm sorry, I was raised Catholic, where there are histories of unaddressed harm. So I think the first step is like, how do we create religious communities that make it clear that that is not okay? And also can do the education and norm setting. There is this worksheet. It is available on Transform Harm. It is also available through the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collaborative. It's called pod mapping. It's a way that people in their individual lives can say, here's what I would need if I experienced violence, and here are the people who I would go to if I experienced violence. Here are the people I would go to if I caused harm. I think whole groups can do pod mapping as a way to map out sources of support. I think people can advertise there are more and more lists of like, don't call the cops in my city, but call these places. Like churches can amplify that information. We also train groups in safety teams. Like people can create a safety team within their church, a place where if there is argument, harm, violence, these are the people that will hold it. These are the people, this is the committee that does culture setting around consent. So I think that there are so many options. And then churches can also advocate with other churches. And also if there is a church in your network where harm is being named and unaddressed, to the extent that you have relationship and can put leverage on them to be a survivor safe space, that's something else I can think of off the top of my head.
Ejeris, there's another question that's asking whether there is a role for police once we have these community safety teams in place.
I don't think so for me. I don't. Mostly because the history, the training, is there, so like there, sometimes I want to unpack that question a bit. Is there a need to call people for help to intervene in violence? Probably, right? But that could look many ways. Part of the, like, there are so many structural and historical issues with policing, but there's also a piece around like, there are many police who are not trained for what they're responding to. They're not trained in harm reduction. They're not trained in addressing overdoses, in mental health crisis, in domestic violence. So, or there have just been so many situations where recognizing that, like, I have held survivors, I've supported survivors through sexual violence. Some of whom who I'm one of the first people they're talking to, others who they went to the police, and we, more often than not, and I'm not saying overwhelmingly because I don't really do absolutes, right? But we shouldn't assume that the experiences that survivors are having when they do choose to report to the police are safe experiences, right? I know many, many people who have been blamed, who have not received support. So for me, I want to create communities where where we train up everyday people in addressing a whole host of forms of harm, abuse, and violence, because often everyday people are the first people who learn about what's happening. To where there is room for people who are well practiced in certain arenas who can be called on to intervene. And for me, and where we don't actually need communities that are policed, because we have communities that are well resourced, right? We have communities where people have the food they need, the housing they need, the jobs that they need, all of these pieces that also contribute to more precarious or people living in more violent situations. So yeah. So Arna, I think you're muted.
Look at that. Some really, really powerful questions coming through, and we have limited time together, so I'm going to try and pull some of them together. One of the questions, just really, and I'm experiencing this in my own community, folks who are involved in this transformative justice work tend to burn out really quickly. And so, what are some ways to do this work and grow and expand this work in a way that's sustainable and that doesn't harm practitioners?
You know, that's a very fair and good question, because I think I can't tell you how many times I've burnt out and then like kind of picked myself back, like and tried again. So I do events like this, not because I actually enjoy hearing myself speak. I do events like this because we need you all to join us. And so I think the more people we have building the skills, the less we need to stop seeing violence as a separate thing that someone else does, because that's what contributes to burnout. Burnout is about, we don't have enough people to say, I can't hold it, but so and so can, right? So real simple but clear point. When I was working at my first anti-violence job, every single time I went on vacation, there was a murder. Every single time. We did not have a system, and I was so caught up that I didn't have, it took a while for someone to say, what if you train somebody else on like what are the first things to do when a family comes to you so that you can stay on vacation. And I was like, oh, I didn't think about that because I was so busy, right? And so kind of like wrapped in this. There is a way that um, when you're in that kind of cycle of supporting people, like it can affect your ability to think long term a bit. And so I think addressing burnout requires more people, because the hardest thing is when you're exhausted, but you don't know who else can help. So you say yes anyway. I would think like every time a practitioner does that, that's kind of when we are contributing to our own burnout. And it's structural, it's not our fault. I'm not blaming, us. But I am saying the more of all of us that can hold these instances, the more that we are less likely to burn people out in the work and the process.
Thanks. Thank you for that. I'm just something I'm really feeling in my community and building a study group around right now. There's a question asking if we're having a process with someone who's perpetrated harm in the community. How do you balance centering the survivor or survivors while also balancing that person's needs in the process? And like, what's the line between that and enabling?
My best answer is it's tricky. So there's a quote from Danielle Sered that I might mess up, and she names like no one I know first enters violence by committing it. And so I think it's pretty hard to just to transform violent and abusive behavior without attending to people's needs. And so in ways you see that show up in processes are sometimes the need is education, sometimes the need is mental health support, sometimes it's steady employment. Uh, I think that this is part of the landscape, and it's why our system. It's one of the reasons why our system isn't working, right? Like because um, we don't see the needs of people who've caused harm, and we can't. We need to be able to hold. What I think is important is holding the needs and goals of the survivor. What is the goal? That the violence stops, that I am safe from now on, that I can be safe at my job or safe at my church, right? Like, what are the needs and what are the constructs of those needs? And then when I've been either holding processes or on what people call like the team for the person who's caused harm, we get to go deep around like what is getting in the way of safer behavior. And often in my experience, there is a piece of it around people need to hear. A lot of people don't have not seen themselves as harm doers. Sometimes people are putting themselves in situations where they don't know or remember what happened or what they did. And then there's a piece around learning consent, and then what are the supports that people need. It's there. Unfortunately, there's not one answer, and it's an answer that happens in practice. But that's what I'll name.
So there's a few questions that are about that I think ultimately are about shaking people's kind of sense of what they know. There's like some people are really private and wouldn't want the whole community in their business. There's like people who really believe in this hierarchy and law and order. And how do you engage with folks who are so bought in to the system as it is?
I think positionality really matters when somebody is bought in. I'm trying to understand why they're bought in. So, because it's a different approach. So, if I'm navigating, I don't know, a Black grandmother who has lost a child to gun violence, who is bought in because that the trial felt like the most justice she'd probably received in her life. That's a different conversation than a younger white person who's moved to an urban neighborhood who may not understand why calling 911 on their neighbors is not a good idea, right? So I'm trying to actually attend to, in the grandmother's case, uh, often when I've worked with surviving families, they know that the person, even if there was a conviction, this didn't necessarily mean change for the person who is in prison, and often can mean more violence for them. Um, and they still are living in communities that are violent. And most people who've experienced harm and violence also know somebody uh, who's experienced the violence of the police or the criminal legal system. When I'm when I'm talking to folks who are really bought in because their privilege is masking the experiences of others, then I'm more thinking about white privilege, allyship, and what does solidarity mean, and how solidarity can mean so much more than, like, solidarity is not about like I'm safe so I don't care what happens to y'all, right? And how truly, if we have a system that's in place to make the trade-off of causing some communities deep harm to create safety for others, then we're all collectively unsafe. And that if we want to build communities and worlds of interdependence and interconnection, we need to shift what's happening, particularly with oppressed communities and the violence of policing and prisons.
And I think, oh, there's so much good stuff here, but I think this will have to be our last one. How do we share these ideas, these examples, these processes on a national level, since so much of the work seems very local?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea. Here's the benefit of local work. The benefit of local work is national strategies can only go so far, right? There is a piece that is context. It's much easier to address violence on your block or street because you understand the people, the players, and what's happening. So on a national level, I really love whether it's we created a community safety toolkit that people can use and borrow pieces of. You can use the tools in the creative interventions toolkit. So on the national level, we're sharing strategies and tools. And then I'm asking people in your household, family, block, neighborhood, regular organization to bring those tools as a conversation piece, as like step one. Um, and so I think it's both, how do we connect people with movements that are local and national, but the webs of safety we're going to create are going to happen and be most effective at the local level. At the national level, we're sharing, this is what's working, right? This is this is um, this is what I learned, and it was useful. So when I was working on safety teams and work in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, it was really useful to connect with groups of folks in Chicago who were doing it to say, oh, okay, so this is how you all were able to address when one of your young members was getting repetitively targeted as they walked down the street. This is how you guys created um, like safe housing for this person to get away from their attacker. Okay, that reminds me of somebody who was experiencing street violence and we did this. So that's what I see the national to local connection being, like recognizing that even in the criminal legal system, um, there are, right, like there things, people are organizing those systems locally as well. So I do think there's a piece around information, and there's a lot of information and complexity that we need to sit in when we're transforming violence and harm, and be willing to sit in.
Well, thank you so much, Ejeris. I see the chat is so interesting. I'm going to save it and share it with you because there's really powerful things happening there. Deborah says there should be a transformative justice movie, something that shows people a process and all, and just how it unfolded so people can have more imagination if they don't already have it. I this is for later, but I would actually love to talk about some examples of movies and TV shows that we love that actually do have these processes, which may not be clearly named. This was a transformative process, like The Good Place and Steven Universe. I think are some really sharp examples of a community holding someone through something. So I see also a number of white folks in the chat saying, I want to figure out how to be an ally in this work as a white person. And there's an offering from Jade J to email them at katejohansson20@gmail.com if other white folks want to talk about this work without draining people of color. So thank you so much for that offering, Jade. I am really glad that we're doing this. I think you've definitely helped open my imagination, and I already consider myself an abolitionist. And again, very deeply grateful for contextualizing this within a history of decades and decades of people looking after their communities without police. Um, if you have any parting words, the floor is yours.
I guess the last thing I will say is I was having one of those days that despite how long I do this, I was nervous coming here. And so the history matters to me because I need to know that it makes me feel less untethered, right? So the first thing I did before to ground myself was I, in some ways, was like, well, let all of those who I know and who don't know, who've come before me and who have been creating safety mechanisms in their communities years and years before me, let that powerful legacy carry me today. And so that's just, I think it's just to remember, sometimes it feels so daunting and overwhelming if we are supposed to create something brand new that no one, as opposed to, let's look at what is there that may have not been written down, but someone remembers. And let's look at the things that we might not have seen as strategies, but were just ways of being
Mm-hmm.
to ground ourselves in what does it mean to get more, to make it, to bring more people into it, to write it down, to train on it. So much of my training work is writing down stuff that people already have done and practicing it. So not like other people's knowledge, y'all know what I'm saying, but like things we do in community. All that's to say, you all have more of the legacy of community safety and your future to explore. And I am grateful to be a part of your journey and excited for all of you all who are deepening your impact in our movements. And thanks.
Uh, tell us how to find more of your work.
So you can, so vision, www.visionchangewind.com is one way to reach me. I'm the only Ejeris in the world. So at Ejeris on Twitter, Ejeris on Instagram, right? I am, yeah, you can really, like, all the embarrassing and non-embarrassing things, they are there for you because I have a pretty unique name. And yeah, you can contact Vision Change Wind there. And yeah, pick up the tools, deepen your work. We need y'all to build the worlds that we want.
And there's also a question, how can we compensate you directly? And I know that we have a donation link for Vision Change Win, which I'll drop in the chat. But any other ways that you would want people to support your work?
I donating to us is great because it's a way like to support us to provide free tools and scholarships for our work. If you want to learn more about safety teams, we are doing regular trainings monthly, and people can sign up for those. There is a pay link there, but we also do scholarships for folks who can't afford. If you want to earmark a donation and say, I'm putting this in so that you can provide 10 free slots of your training, we definitely accept that. It's more just like support us and support me to do the work that we love, that community will compensate us for, but not necessarily systems.
Thank you so much, Ejeris.
Thank you.